My evil mother betrayed me with my future husband in the worst possible way. I, completely shattered, decided to take revenge on her, and in just a few days, her life turned into a complete nightmare. Laura was sitting in front of the mirror in her room, adjusting the silver necklace she always wore during important moments. She knew tonight was crucial. After months of dating, Marcos, her boyfriend, was about to meet her family, and something in the air told her this meeting would change the dynamic between everyone. Laura's hands trembled slightly as she fixed her makeup. She couldn't stop thinking about how badly she wanted everything to go well, but there was also a knot in her stomach that she couldn't ignore. "It's going to be fine," she whispered to herself, as if saying it out loud could convince her. Outside, the sun was beginning to set behind the hills surrounding the Medina estate. Orange and golden colors bathed the landscape, creating a pastoral scene that was almost unreal, but the tension Laura felt made it heavier than it appeared. The sound of the front door indicated that Marcos had arrived, and her heart skipped a beat. Marcos parked his car in front of the entrance, his eyes scanning the imposing facade of the house. This was his first time visiting the estate, and he couldn't help but feel somewhat intimidated. There was something majestic and, at the same time, mysterious about the place. The last conversation he had with Laura still echoed in his mind. He knew her relationship with her mother, Victoria, was tense, but he hadn't dug too deep into the details. However, now that he was about to meet her family, the weight of that tension was becoming palpable. Marcos took a deep breath, trying to relax. The journey had been long, and the last thing he wanted was to start the weekend with nerves. He held a bouquet of flowers in his hand, a small peace offering, hoping it would make a good impression. "Come on, Marcos. It's just her parents. This is going to be fine," he whispered to himself before getting out of the car. As he entered, Laura greeted him with a smile, despite her nervousness. She hugged him tightly, as if seeking comfort in his presence. "Marcos, they're excited to meet you," Laura said, trying to keep the calmness in her voice. "My dad is charming, but my mom, well, sometimes she can be a little difficult." Marcos nodded, already knowing that Victoria, Laura's mother, was a woman of strong character, but he hadn't delved into the details. She was her mother, and that was what mattered. As they approached the main hall, the sounds of distant conversation reached them. Gustavo, Laura's father, was standing by the fireplace when they entered. Tall, with big, calloused hands, he had the presence of a man who had worked the land all his life, despite owning a large estate. His eyes were kind, and they lit up when he saw his daughter and her guest. "Marcos, welcome," Gustavo exclaimed with a warm smile, extending his hand. "I've heard a lot about you." "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir," Marcos replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you for having me. Please, call me Gustavo. Your family here." Marcos felt part of the tension melt away. While Gustavo was exactly as Laura had described him, it was impossible not to notice the silent figure sitting off to the side, watching from the shadows of the armchair. Victoria, Laura's mother, was an impressive woman. Her presence filled the room, even without saying a word. Her dark, piercing eyes and posture exuded authority. Her features, though softened by age, still held a cold, distant beauty. "Victoria, this is Marcos," Laura said, with a cautious tone in her voice, as if preparing the ground for something important. Victoria nodded slightly, her lips forming a barely perceptible smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Marcos," she said in a soft but firm voice. "Laura talks a lot about you." The silence that followed her comment was brief but heavy with meaning. Marcos noticed that, unlike Gustavo, Victoria's reception was neither warm nor distant, but something more enigmatic, as if she were evaluating him, measuring every detail of his behavior. Laura quickly glanced at him, as if expecting him to break the silence, but Marcos decided to stay quiet, preferring not to force the situation. Dinner was served in the large dining room, a spacious room decorated with antique paintings and a long wooden table that could accommodate the entire family. Gustavo and Laura filled the conversation with anecdotes and laughter, while Victoria remained silent, observing closely. Every time Marcos looked up, he could feel Victoria's gaze on him, as if she were trying to decipher him. He couldn't deny that Laura's mother was an imposing figure, but there was something about her that piqued his curiosity. After dinner, Gustavo suggested going for a walk around the farm. He wanted to show Marcos the land and, at the same time, talk business. Laura stayed behind, talking with her mother, while the two men headed toward the garden. The night was cool, and the starry sky created a sense of serenity that contrasted with the tension Marcos still felt. "Laura is a good girl," said Gustavo, breaking the silence as they walked. "Sometimes she's difficult, especially with her mother, but she has a good heart. I just hope she can find her way without too much pressure." "I know," Marcos replied, looking at him seriously. "I want the best for her. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make her happy." Gustavo nodded as if approving Marcos's words. "Life here isn't easy. This farm has been in my family for generations, and sometimes these expectations weigh on us more than they should. But we all do what we can." As they spoke, Marcos couldn't stop thinking about Victoria's coldness, the way she looked at him as if she were hiding something behind her perfect facade. There was a tension between mother and daughter that he still didn't fully understand, but he knew he would eventually figure it out. When they returned to the house, Victoria and Laura were still in the living room. The conversation between mother and daughter seemed tense, judging by their expressions. Laura quickly stood up when she saw Marcos, but Victoria remained seated, her eyes fixed on him. "I hope you feel welcome here, Marcos," said Victoria with a polite tone, but a coldness that chilled the room. "Because this family can be quite complicated." The comment hung in the air, and Marcos realized at that moment that this weekend would not be as he had imagined. What had started as a simple visit to meet his girlfriend's parents was about to turn into something much deeper, darker, and full of secrets. And at the center of it all was Victoria, watching every movement with an intensity he couldn't fully comprehend, but that was beginning to unsettle him more than he was willing to admit. The next morning, the day began with a thick fog covering the farm like a silent veil. The fresh air filled the Medina house, but inside the grand residence, everything seemed still, as if the day hadn't truly begun. Marcos woke up early, uneasy from the events of the previous night. The image of Victoria watching him from the living room, her piercing and cold gaze, still haunted him. There was something about this woman that disturbed him deeply, and yet he couldn't help feeling a strange attraction to her, a kind of magnetism that troubled him more than he was willing to admit. After taking a shower and getting dressed, he went downstairs to the dining room, where Gustavo was already waiting with a cup of coffee in hand and a friendly smile on his face. The morning atmosphere was much more relaxed than the palpable tension of the previous evening. "Good morning, Marcos," exclaimed Gustavo, getting up to shake his hand. "I hope you slept well." "Yes, very well, thank you," replied Marcos, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. The night had been long, and sleep had eluded him several times as he thought about the family dynamics he had witnessed. Laura and Victoria still hadn't come down, which made the conversation between Gustavo and Marcos seem more intimate, almost as if the moment had been planned in advance. Gustavo sat down again, paused, and after a brief silence, motioned for Marcos to follow him outside for a walk around the farm. "I want to show you something," said Gustavo, with a tone suggesting that what he had to say was not just a conversation about the landscape. They walked out into the garden, and the morning fog was slowly lifting, revealing the vast land stretching farther than the eye could see. The vineyards and fields seemed endless, a blend of natural beauty and human effort. As they walked, Gustavo began to talk about the farm's history. "This land has been in my family for generations," he explained, his voice filled with pride and nostalgia. "I've spent my whole life here, just like my father and his father before him. It's a responsibility, but also a privilege." Marcos nodded as he listened to Gustavo. He could feel the weight of those words, the burden that this heritage carried. Gustavo seemed to be a man of tradition, someone who deeply valued continuity and legacy. But Marcos also noticed something else in his words, an underlying melancholy, a weariness accumulated over the years. Finally, they reached a small hill where they could see an old building, an abandoned wine cellar. The stone walls showed signs of wear, and the structure, while sturdy, clearly needed renovation. "This is where I want you to step in," Marcos said Gustavo, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "This wine cellar has been in use for years, but I believe with the right renovation, it could become something great. It could be a new space for the farm, something that brings new life to this place." Marcos observed the construction with a professional eye, analyzing every detail. It was an ambitious project, but doable. Ideas began to form in his mind as he imagined how he could transform the space into something modern and functional without losing the rustic and traditional touch that characterized the estate. "It would be an honor to work on this," Marcos said finally, excited by the idea. "There's a lot of potential here." Gustavo smiled, relieved to see the same passion in Marcos's eyes that he had felt for so many years. "I knew you'd think the same," Gustavo said. "But beyond the project, I want you to understand something. This isn't just about restoring a cellar. It's about restoring something deeper, something that goes beyond the walls of this house." Marcos frowned, not fully understanding. The relationship between Laura and her mother, Victoria, has been complicated for years, Gustavo continued, his voice dropping as if confessing a painful secret. Victoria has always been a strong, determined woman, but that created a distance between her and our daughter. Laura has always felt that she was never good enough, that she couldn't meet her mother's expectations. As Gustavo spoke, Marcos began to understand better the tense atmosphere he had felt since arriving. The tension between Victoria and Laura was not just a passing misunderstanding, but something deeper, rooted in years of emotional distance and unmet expectations. "Victoria has been a great wife and mother," Gustavo said, almost as if needing to remind himself of that. "But there's something in her that changed over the years. She became colder, more distant. And Laura has resented that, always seeking her approval and never feeling good enough." Marcos felt a sharp pain in his chest as he heard that. He knew Laura was a strong woman, but he also sensed her vulnerability, that need to be accepted and fully loved by her mother. "And what can I do in all of this?" Marcos asked, genuinely concerned. Gustavo looked him directly in the eye, a serious expression on his face. "I'm not asking you to fix it. But if you're going to be part of this family, you need to understand the context, the challenges we face. And I want you to help Laura find her own way. Maybe your presence here, working on the estate, could be a catalyst for things to change between them." Gustavo's words left Marcos deep in thought. He felt a great responsibility not only for the project Gustavo had proposed, but also for the family dynamics. He knew he was entering tricky territory, but he also felt drawn to the opportunity to do something meaningful, both professionally and personally. "I'll do what I can," he finally answered sincerely. "I want the best for Laura and for you too." Gustavo patted him on the shoulder, as if that simple gesture confirmed that he had made the right choice by trusting him. "I knew I could count on you." As they returned to the house, Marcos remained silent, processing what he had just heard. The tension between Laura and her mother, the weight of the family history and expectations, all began to make more sense. But deep down, something else troubled him: Victoria's presence, her distant behavior, and, even more, the uncomfortable attraction he was starting to feel for her. When they entered the house, the sound of footsteps upstairs indicated that Victoria and Laura were already awake. The encounter with Victoria the night before still disturbed him. There was something in her gaze that challenged him, something that made him want to understand more about her, even though he knew it was dangerous territory. "Today we'll start with the design," Marco said, trying to focus on the work. But as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was developing in the shadows, something that went beyond the professional relationship or the family issues. He knew this project was going to be more complicated than he had initially imagined, and not just in terms of architectural restoration. The tension in the Medina house continued to rise, and Marcos couldn't shake the feeling that, by agreeing to work on the estate, he had stepped into a much more dangerous emotional game than he had anticipated. The sun was already high in the sky when Marcos decided to take a break from the sketches he had been working on for the cellar renovation. Gustavo's words continued to resonate in his mind. The estate didn't just need a physical restoration, but an emotional one. He had taken on the challenge of working on the project with a mix of excitement and responsibility, but he knew that the real work was happening on another level. The tension in the Medina house was not something that could be solved with a few new bricks and some paint. He decided to step outside into the garden to clear his mind. As he walked between the well-kept hedges and flowers, the fresh air and the sound of birds singing offered him brief relief from the swirling worries in his mind. However, it didn't take long for him to realize that he was not alone. Victoria was walking not far from him, seemingly lost in her own thoughts. Seeing her, he felt a mix of discomfort and attraction that troubled him more than he was willing to admit. He tried to keep walking, but his steps grew slower. Finally, Victoria noticed and, instead of ignoring him or leaving, walked toward him with a quiet grace that only heightened the aura of mystery surrounding her. "I didn't expect to find you here," Victoria said, with a soft smile, yet one full of intentions hard to decipher. "This is my refuge, my little corner of peace." Marcos tried to smile back, although he knew the discomfort between them was palpable. "It seems like a good place to think," he replied, looking for something neutral to say. "The estate is beautiful." Victoria stopped beside him, her dark eyes scanning the garden, but it was clear her mind was elsewhere. "I used to spend more time here, taking care of the flowers, making sure everything was perfect. Over time, I guess I stopped doing that." Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of nostalgia that Marcos immediately picked up. "Sometimes I wonder when I stopped taking care of what's important." The comment was ambiguous, but Marcos sensed she wasn't just talking about the garden. An uneasy silence followed, during which Victoria turned to him, her gaze much more intense than before. "Marcos, you're not the first to come here trying to save something. But I warn you, this estate, this family, have deeper wounds than they seem at first glance." Marcos felt like her words struck him directly. His first instinct was to defend himself, to make sure he was only there to work on the renovations, but he knew Victoria was talking about something deeper. There was something in her tone, in her gaze, that caught him. It was as if she knew something he hadn't figured out yet, something tangled in the invisible dynamics of the family. "I'm not here to change anything that doesn't want to be changed," he answered, carefully choosing his words. "I just want to help in any way I can and be there for Laura." Mentioning Laura seemed to shift the energy between them. Victoria narrowed her eyes as if weighing the sincerity behind those words. "Are you here for Laura or for yourself?" she asked, her voice sharper than he expected. The question threw him off. Marcos opened his mouth to respond, but realized he wasn't sure what to say. Of course, he was there for Laura, or at least that's what he kept telling himself. But the doubt Victoria planted with that question made him reflect. There was something else keeping him there, something more than just his relationship with Laura. Victoria, as though sensing his confusion, took a step closer to him. While her proximity wasn't overtly intrusive, Marcos felt the shift in the atmosphere between them. The latent attraction he had felt from the start was there, more present than ever. But there was something more, something that unsettled him deeply. "I don't blame you," Victoria continued, her voice now softer, but still carrying emotional weight. "This house, it can be a prison for some, a refuge for others. Sometimes I don't even know what it is for me." The comment hung in the air, but Marcos was beginning to understand that Victoria wasn't just talking about the house. Her relationship with Gustavo, her role as a mother, the life she had built there, all of it seemed to be questioned in those few words. Marcos tried to find an answer, but before he could say anything, Victoria abruptly changed the subject. "What do you think of the project?" she asked, pointing to the barn at the end of the garden. "Gustavo seems excited about the idea of renovating it." Marcos breathed a sigh of relief at the opportunity to shift the conversation, though he couldn't shake the weight of what they had just discussed. "It's an incredible project. The barn has so much potential, and I think with a bit of work, it could become something really special," he said, trying to sound enthusiastic. Although, honestly, it seems like there's more at stake here than just bricks and mortar. Victoria looked at him, and for a brief moment, Marcos thought he saw a glimmer of approval in her eyes. "You're more observant than I thought," she remarked, almost in a whisper. "Yes, there's more at stake. There always is in this house." The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but Victoria made no effort to ease the tension. Instead, she slowly walked over to a stone bench under a nearby tree and sat down. Marcos followed her, unsure whether he should stay or leave, but something kept him there, as if this conversation was crucial in some way. After what seemed like an eternity, Victoria spoke again, this time with a frankness that surprised him. "Do you know what it's like to be a mother and feel like no matter what you do, your daughter always looks at you with resentment?" Her voice wasn't trembling, but controlled, as if it was a truth she had learned to live with. "It doesn't matter how hard you try, it will never be enough. Laura has never forgiven me for being who I am." Marcos listened in silence, unable to interrupt. He knew that Victoria's words were more of a confession than a conversation. She was unloading years of frustration, pain, and regret, and he, in some way, had become the accidental confidant of those feelings. "I love her, of course I love her," Victoria continued, looking at the floor, "but the distance between us has grown so much that I don't know how to go back. And every time I try to get closer, I only make things worse." Marcos finally spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Maybe it's not too late to try again." Victoria let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Try? Again?" she repeated. "With what? With more lies? With more empty promises?" "The truth, Marcos, is that sometimes the damage is done and there's nothing you can do to undo it. You can keep trying, but all you're doing is reopening old wounds." Marcos didn't know how to respond. There was something in Victoria's sincerity that disarmed him. Despite everything, there was still a connection between them, something that went beyond mere conversation. "It's not always about undoing the damage," he finally said. "Sometimes it's about learning to live with the scars." Victoria looked him in the eyes for a long moment, and for the first time since he had met her, Marcos thought he saw genuine vulnerability in her gaze. Then, as if realizing she had said too much, Victoria stood up abruptly. "Maybe you're right," she said, her voice becoming distant again, "but some scars are deeper than you think." Without another word, Victoria started walking back toward the house, leaving him alone in the garden, lost in contradictory thoughts. Marcos knew that he had just witnessed something deep, something that, one way or another, would change the course of his relationship with Laura, with Victoria, and perhaps with the entire Medina family. The atmosphere inside the Medina house had become increasingly tense. The days went by in an almost calculated routine, but beneath the surface, the emotions of each of the characters were intertwined in a knot that seemed on the verge of unraveling. Marcos tried to focus on his work in the cellar, but he couldn't shake the growing tension that had started to form between him and Victoria after their conversation in the garden. That day, while reviewing some plans in the dining room, he heard voices coming from the living room. The voices of Victoria and Laura were unmistakable, and although they started off soft, the conversation soon began to rise. It was as though each word was another step toward the inevitable explosion that had been building. Marcos placed the plans on the table and quietly approached the living room, not wanting to interrupt, but unable to ignore what was happening. "I don't understand why you always do this, Mom." Laura's voice was full of frustration. "You always find a way to belittle everything I do. Is it ever going to be enough for you?" Victoria, who had been silent up until then, responded in her cold, controlled tone, though there was a slight crack in her voice that Marcos immediately noticed. "Laura, that's not true. I've always wanted the best for you. If it weren't, I wouldn't waste my time telling you what I think. Or do you prefer I lie to you? That's not it. I don't need you to tell me how to live my life or what decisions to make. I'm an adult, and you've always treated me as though I weren't." Laura stopped for a moment, and Marcos heard the tremor in her voice as she added, "It's as if everything I do disappoints you. As if you're ashamed of me." The silence that followed was so heavy that Marcos felt the need to step away, not wanting to witness something so intimate and painful. But before he could decide, Victoria responded, her voice quieter this time, more vulnerable. I would never be ashamed of you, Victoria. You're my daughter. But there are things you can't understand, things I've done for you, for this family, that maybe one day you will." Laura didn't seem convinced. Her face, always so strong and resolute, now showed the marks of years of accumulated resentment. "Then explain to me," Laura asked. "Because the only thing I've felt since I was a little girl is that I was always fighting against you. Always trying to be something I'm not, something you wanted me to be. I was never enough, was I?" Victoria took a step toward her daughter, as if wanting to comfort her, but something stopped her. Maybe it was pride, or perhaps the fear of showing too much weakness in front of her. Instead, she crossed her arms, taking on that defensive, controlled posture that Marcos had come to associate with her. "It was never that, Laura. I always wanted you to be strong, to not make the same mistakes I made. What you see as criticism, I see as protection." Laura let out a bitter, disbelieving laugh. "Protection?" she repeated, shaking her head. "You didn't protect me. You made me feel like I could never do anything right, like I would never be good enough for you. If that's protection, Mom, then I'd rather you hadn't protected me." The comment hurt Victoria deeply, but as always, she didn't let her emotions show on her face. "It's easy for you to talk like that, Laura. You have no idea what decisions I've had to make. Decisions that affected our whole family, decisions I had to make alone because your father wasn't willing to carry that weight." Gustavo's name lingered in the air, and Laura blinked in surprise. Although her relationship with her mother had always been tense, she had never heard Victoria speak of her father in that way. "What decisions?" Laura asked, her tone softer, almost vulnerable for the first time. "What are you talking about?" Victoria stayed silent, as if debating with herself whether or not to reveal what she had been holding back for years. Finally, she took a deep breath and continued. "There was a time, before you were born, when everything seemed perfect. Your father and I were happy, the farm was doing well. But then, things changed. Your father made mistakes, and I had to make decisions to save what was left of this family. Things I've never talked about because I didn't want you to carry that burden." Laura stared intently, as if trying to process what she was hearing. "What kind of decisions?" Laura insisted. And Victoria, for the first time in a long while, seemed tired. Not just physically, but emotionally drained. "There were people I had to make deals with. People who couldn't be trusted, but who had the power to destroy everything your father had built. And to save this farm, to keep our life intact, I had to make sacrifices. Sacrifices that even your father doesn't fully know about. And I never wanted you to know because I didn't want you to carry that weight. But in the end, I think somehow you felt it." Laura fell silent, shocked by this revelation. She had never imagined that her mother had had to deal with something like that. To her, Victoria had always been the distant, cold woman who prioritized appearances and expectations over everything. "Why didn't you tell me?" Laura finally asked, her voice broken. "If you had been honest with me, maybe things would have been different." Victoria lowered her gaze, unable to respond immediately. There was something tragic about her posture, the way she finally admitted her own failure as a mother, not through words, but through her silence. "I didn't know how," she finally said. "I always thought it would be better if you didn't know. But I was wrong. I've made a lot of mistakes, and this is just another one." The air in the room felt heavy, filled with emotions that neither of them could untangle at that moment. Marcos, who had been silently observing from the hallway, felt as if he had witnessed something deeply personal and painful. He knew he shouldn't be there, that he should leave, but he was too immersed in what he had just heard. Laura turned her head toward him, and their eyes met. There was no anger in her gaze, just a mixture of surprise and relief. "What are you doing here, listening to all this?" Laura asked, but her voice didn't carry anger. Instead, there was a palpable vulnerability. She seemed to find a strange comfort in not being completely alone at that moment, even if Marcos's presence wasn't entirely welcome. Victoria, noticing Marcos, felt her composure crack. She had heard the entire conversation between mother and daughter, and the reality of her vulnerability became evident. Before she could start crying, she quickly left the room, leaving Laura and Marcos alone. Marcos remained silent, processing the situation. The tension between mother and daughter had reached a critical point, and he had, inadvertently, become a witness to it. He wasn't sure how to proceed, aware of how delicate the moment was. "I don't know what to say," Marcos finally confessed, his voice filled with uncertainty. Laura, still facing the reality of her conversation with Victoria, simply nodded. "You don't have to say anything," she answered softly. "Sometimes we just need someone to be there. I'm grateful that you're always with me in moments like this, Marcos." "I love you," she added with a sigh, her gaze conveying deep sincerity. A silence settled between them, a silence filled with unspoken meanings and unresolved emotions, as Victoria's shadow faded into the distance, leaving them both alone with the reality of their complicated circumstances. Minutes after leaving Laura in her room, more at ease after the revealing conversation with her mother, Marcos decided to find Victoria. When he found her, he saw that she was crying, devastated by the confrontation she had had with her daughter. Without thinking, Marcos hugged her. In that moment of vulnerability and closeness, driven by an intense attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface, Marcos kissed her. The kiss, driven by the emotional weight of the moment, came with such naturalness that it surprised them both. The storm continued outside, covering the estate in a dense darkness, only interrupted by the echo of thunder and the constant tapping of the rain against the windows. Inside the house, the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the crackling of the fireplace in the living room. Minutes later, Marco stood in the hallway, his mind trying to process what had just happened with Victoria. His heart was pounding, and though his body still felt the proximity of Victoria, his conscience screamed that he had made a mistake. He tried to regain control, to remember why he was there in the first place, but the forbidden kiss, the intensity of the moment, kept overwhelming him. He knew that his relationship with Laura, already fragile from the tension of the last few days, was now hanging by a thin thread. Marcos ran a hand through his hair, feeling the moisture on his palms. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to move. The house was large, but it felt smaller than ever, as though the walls were closing in on him with every step he took toward the room he shared with Laura. He knew he had to face her, but he wasn't prepared for what would happen next. When he reached the door to their room, he paused for a moment, gathering strength. Finally, he turned the doorknob carefully and entered. The light from a dim lamp illuminated the room, and Laura was sitting on the bed, her legs crossed, a concerned expression on her face. Her eyes immediately locked on him, and Marcos felt the weight of his guilt pressing even harder. "You're here," Laura said in a low voice, with no trace of reproach, but with evident worry. I was starting to get worried. The storm, the blackout. I thought something had happened. Marcos felt a knot form in his throat. Laura's gaze, filled with genuine concern for him, pierced through him. How could he look her in the eye after what he had done? But Laura couldn't know, at least not yet. "I'm sorry, I was downstairs going over the plans with your father," he quickly lied, trying to make his voice sound convincing. And then, well, everything suddenly went dark with the power outage, so I stayed in the living room waiting. Laura looked at him in silence for a moment, as if her eyes were trying to read something beyond his words. There was a distance between them that hadn't been there when they arrived at the estate, and they both knew it. But before she could say anything else, Laura looked away, as if she were holding back her own thoughts. "Today was difficult," she said, breaking the silence. "What happened with my mother? I don't know what to think. I don't know how to feel." Marcos nodded, grateful for the opportunity to change the course of the conversation, though the topic was still complicated. He walked over to the bed and sat beside her, trying to offer support. "I heard part of what happened," he said, unsure of how to approach the topic. "What your mother told you, the decisions she had to make. How do you feel about that?" Laura sighed, hugging her knees and resting her head on them. Her hair fell in soft waves, and her face seemed younger in that moment, as though the memories and revelations of the day had reduced her to the girl who had once desperately sought her mother's affection. Confused. "My whole life I thought she saw me as a disappointment, someone who never lived up to her expectations. And suddenly I realized that, in her mind, she was trying to protect me all along. But I can't help feeling like that doesn't justify how she made me feel. Marcos listened in silence, knowing that what she said was true. The emotional wounds that Victoria had caused in Laura wouldn't heal overnight, not even with a sudden confession. The distance between them was deep, a crack that had opened years ago and perhaps might never fully close. "It's complicated," Marcos finally said, searching for the right words. "I think sometimes our parents believe they're doing the best for us, but the impact of their decisions doesn't always align with their intentions. That doesn't mean what they did was right or that they didn't hurt you." Laura nodded slowly, not lifting her gaze. "I know, but how am I supposed to move on from this? How am I supposed to trust her when everything she built was based on secrets and lies?" Marcos felt the weight of the question. The relationship between Laura and Victoria seemed broken in a way that might never fully be repaired. However, he also knew that there was a chance, though small, that they could find a way forward. But for that to happen, he first had to be honest with himself and with Laura. His stomach tightened as he thought about the kiss he had shared with Victoria. It was a secret that weighed on him like a rock, and though it had been a momentary mistake, he knew the consequences of what had happened could be devastating. Still, he wasn't ready to confess. Not now. Not with Laura so fragile and vulnerable. "Maybe you don't have to make any decisions right now," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe what you need is time. Time to understand what you feel, to process everything." Laura lifted her head and looked at him for the first time since the conversation began. Her eyes were filled with confusion, but also gratitude. She seemed to be looking to Marcos for an answer, a solution to everything that was happening, and he wished he could give it to her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what I'd do without you here." Marcos felt those words pierce him like a knife. How could she be so thankful, so trusting, when he had committed such a terrible betrayal? Guilt washed over him again, but he forced himself to smile. "I'll always be here for you," he replied, even though his heart pounded under the weight of the lie. Laura moved closer and hugged him, resting her head against his chest. Marcos returned the hug, feeling the fragility of her body against his. As he held her, his thoughts returned to Victoria, to that forbidden moment that now haunted him. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't the comfortable silence of two people who understand each other. It was a heavy silence, full of secrets and unspoken emotions. Marcos knew this silence wouldn't last forever, that eventually the truth would come to light. That night, as Laura fell asleep in his arms, Marcos lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer he could live with the weight of his guilt. He knew his relationship with Laura was changing, that everything was at risk, and that what had happened with Victoria wasn't just affecting him, but everyone around him. The sound of the storm faded slowly, but the inner storm that was brewing inside him had only just begun. The next morning came with a cold, overcast air. The storm had left the farm covered in a damp, gray sheen. Marcos woke up with the weight of the previous night pressing on his chest. Laura was still asleep, her breathing soft and rhythmic beside him, completely unaware of the whirlwind of thoughts keeping him awake. As he looked at her, a mix of guilt and confusion washed over him. The kiss with Victoria had been a mistake, but the silence he continued to carry only made things worse. He carefully got up, not waking her, and left the room. The hallway was dark and cold, and as he walked to the kitchen, his mind continued to battle with itself. He knew he had to distance himself from Victoria, cut the tie before everything fell apart even more. But there was something about her, an attraction that went beyond the physical, something that pulled him toward her mystery and sadness. When he entered the kitchen, he found Gustavo already awake, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and reading a newspaper. The sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor made Gustavo look up, offering a friendly smile that, in contrast to Marcos's inner chaos, seemed calm. "Good morning, young man," Gustavo greeted him, leaning forward. "Looks like the storm brought in some fresher air. Good weather to continue planning the cellar." Marcos nodded, forcing a smile he didn't feel. The cellar project had become his only refuge, an escape from the emotional tangle he was caught in. Yes, it would be good to get some work done today, he replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Gustavo watched him silently for a moment, as if he could tell something was wrong. Are you okay, Marcos? Gustavo asked, his voice showing genuine concern. Yesterday was a tough day for everyone, especially with what happened between Laura and her mother. I imagine it was hard to be in the middle of all that. Marcos felt a knot form in his stomach. Being in the middle of it all was exactly what was happening, but not in the way Gustavo thought. Yeah, it was complicated, Marcos admitted, not wanting to say too much. But I think Laura needs some time to process everything. What happened with Victoria was unexpected. Gustavo nodded slowly, looking at his cup of coffee as if he too was wrestling with his own thoughts. Victoria's been a woman hard to understand, even for me, he said after a pause. Sometimes I think she's built so many walls around herself that she doesn't even know how to get out. Yesterday, she revealed more than she's revealed in years, and I wonder what else she's hiding. These words hit Marcos harder than he expected. Gustavo had no idea how close he was to the truth. There was something hidden between them, something that, if it came to light, could destroy everything. He tried to change the subject, searching for a way to divert the conversation. Well, we'll do what we can to make sure Laura and Victoria find a way to work things out, he said, though he didn't really believe those words. Gustavo looked at him with a small, sad smile, as if he knew the task ahead was monumental. I hope so, young man. I hope so. Marcos went outside after talking to Gustavo, walking slowly through the grounds of the estate. The cold air cleared his mind a bit, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he needed to do. Cut ties with Victoria before it was too late. Tell Laura the truth. But every option seemed like an inevitable disaster. As he walked through the garden, almost unaware of where he was going, he saw a familiar figure walking toward the cellar. It was Victoria. For a moment, he thought about changing direction, avoiding her, but his feet kept moving toward her. The distance between them quickly shrank, and when they were finally just a few meters apart, Victoria stopped. I didn't expect to see you so early, she said, her voice neutral but with a hint of something more. Marcos stopped, feeling that pull again, that invisible tug drawing him toward her even though he knew he shouldn't. I needed to clear my head, he replied cautiously. Yesterday was complicated. Victoria nodded, looking at him intently. Her dark eyes, always so inscrutable, seemed to be searching for something in his, perhaps confirmation, perhaps an apology. It was, she said softly. But what happened? Between us, Marcos, it can't happen again. The sincerity in her voice surprised Marcos. For the first time since their kiss, Victoria was being direct. No games, no innuendos. Just an acknowledgement that they both knew they had crossed a line. I know, he replied, feeling the weight of his own words. It shouldn't have happened. Victoria took a step toward him, but it wasn't a step of seduction, it was a step of resolution. It was as if, finally, they both were willing to admit that it had been a mistake, that what had connected them was more about the chaos within their lives than any real desire to be together. You have to be honest with Laura, she said, her voice firm. Whatever you've been hiding, whatever is going on inside of you, you need to tell her before this becomes something bigger than it already is. Marcos swallowed, feeling those words pierce him. He knew she was right. The guilt, the secret, it was all turning into a time bomb that sooner or later would explode. But how could he tell Laura the truth without destroying her? It's not that simple, he replied, feeling his voice crack. I can't do that to her. Not now. Victoria looked at him with sadness. Marcos, the longer you put it off, the more damage it will do. To Laura, to yourself, to all of us. The storm that had passed over the estate seemed like nothing compared to the one now raging inside him. He knew he couldn't keep hiding what had happened. Sooner or later, Laura would find out. And when she did, there would be no turning back. You're right, he said finally, his voice full of resignation. I'll tell her the truth. Victoria looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded. It's the best thing you can do, she replied, before turning and walking toward the house. And it will be the hardest thing. Marcos watched her walk away, feeling that in that moment, one chapter was closing. But he knew the next one would be even more devastating. He was left alone in front of the cellar, the cold wind blowing around him. The weight of what he had to do pressed down on him. He didn't know how to face Laura, how to look her in the eye after what he had done. But he could no longer hide. He couldn't keep running from the consequences of his actions. Marcos took a deep breath, mentally preparing for what was to come. He knew that telling Laura the truth would change his life forever. He couldn't predict whether she would forgive him, whether she would understand what had happened, or if she would reject him forever. But one thing was certain. The truth was about to come to light, and with it, the shadows of the past they had both tried to hide. The day passed slowly, as if time itself was resisting the inevitable. Marcos sat on the porch, looking at the gray sky. The fields of the estate stretched out before him, but his mind was far from the peacefulness of the landscape. He knew he had to face Laura, tell her the truth about what had happened with Victoria, but the more he thought about how to approach the conversation, the harder it became to imagine an outcome that didn't destroy everything. Laura's footsteps approaching broke him from his thoughts. He saw her walk toward him, her hair loose and an air of concern he hadn't noticed before. Her look, when she reached him, was different, a mixture of uncertainty and something deeper, as if she already knew something was wrong. "Marcos," she said, her voice calm but with an underlying tension, "can we talk?" Marcos nodded slowly, his stomach twisting. He knew this moment would come, but he wasn't ready to say the words he needed to. Laura sat beside him, but there was a palpable distance between them, as if they both already felt that something was broken. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened these past few days," Laura started, without looking directly at him. "About what happened with my mom, everything she said, and also about us." Marcos felt a pang of anxiety in his chest. He tried to stay calm, but every word Laura spoke seemed to pull him closer to the edge of a cliff. "I know things haven't been easy for you here," she continued, finally looking at him. "I see it in your eyes. You've been distant, like you're carrying something inside you that you don't want to share with me. And I need to know, if there's something you're not telling me." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcos wanted to speak, to confess everything at once, but the words were stuck in his throat. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but he had never felt this much fear about hurting someone as he did now with Laura. "Laura," he started, struggling to find the words. "There's something you need to know." Laura looked at him, her face slowly shifting from concern to a mix of anticipation and fear. She knew that what was coming wasn't going to be good. She braced herself for the worst, but nothing could prepare her for what she was about to hear. "What happened with your mom?" Marcos swallowed, his voice trembling. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. But it happened, and I can't keep hiding it anymore." Laura's eyes widened. The silence that followed was devastating. It was as if the whole world had stopped to absorb the weight of those words. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost breathless. "What happened with my mom, Marcos?" Marcos couldn't look her in the eye. He felt the weight of his betrayal like a stone on his shoulders. "We kissed," he finally said, the words coming out with difficulty. "It shouldn't have happened. It was a mistake, and there are no excuses. But I owed this to you, Laura. I couldn't keep living with this lie." Laura's face went from disbelief to pain in seconds. She jumped up from the chair, her body shaking as she tried to process what she had just heard. Marcos stood up too, but he didn't dare get any closer. He knew any attempt to comfort her at this moment would be in vain. "You kissed my mom?" she repeated, her voice rising with each word, filled with fury and pain. "How could you do this to me?" Marcos tried to speak, but the words seemed irrelevant. Nothing could fix the damage that had already been done. "Laura, I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "There are no excuses. The only thing I can say is that I was wrong, and I should never have let it happen." Laura looked at him as if she couldn't recognize him, as if the man she had loved had turned into someone completely unfamiliar. Tears started streaming down her face, but her expression was filled with rage. "Do you realize what you've done?" she shouted, her voice breaking. "You've betrayed everything we had. Me, Our relationship. And with who? With my own mother. Marcos tried to approach, but Laura raised her hand to stop him. There was a barrier between them that no words could cross. Don't come near me, she warned, her eyes filled with pain that Marcos knew he had caused. I can't even look at you right now. Marcos lowered his head, knowing there was nothing he could say to ease the pain she was feeling. The silence between them was deafening, and with each passing second, he felt the distance between them growing more and more. When did this happen? Laura asked, her voice softer, trembling. How long have you been hiding this from me? It was just once, Marcos said, his voice dull. It happened after the storm. It was a moment of weakness, and I've regretted it ever since. Laura closed her eyes, as if by doing so she could block out the reality of what she had just heard. But the tears didn't stop. Her breathing became faster, and Marcos saw that she was on the verge of losing control. I can't believe this, she said, almost to herself. You were the only person I trusted, the only one on my side. And you did this to me? With her? The word her was loaded with a contempt that Marcos had never heard before in Laura's voice. He knew her relationship with her mother was complicated, but this had taken things to a level he hadn't even imagined. Laura, I know this is impossible to forgive, he said, trying to keep calm. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know because I couldn't keep hiding this from you. Laura looked at him with eyes full of anger, but also deep pain. You're right. I can't forgive this, she said, her voice sharp. This changes everything. Marcos felt an emptiness in his stomach as he heard those words. He knew this moment would come, but facing it was so much worse than he had anticipated. The air between them grew thick, almost suffocating. I need time, Laura finally said, taking a step back. I need to think. I can't be here right now, not with you. Marcos nodded silently, understanding. He watched her as she turned and walked toward the house, her silhouette fading into the distance. The sound of her footsteps on the wet earth echoed in his ears long after she disappeared from view. He stayed there, alone, weighed down by the burden of his own decisions. He knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return, and the cost was higher than he had ever imagined. The truth had come to light, but now he had to face the consequences of his revelation. And in that moment, as the cold wind swept through the estate, he knew the worst storm was yet to come. The house felt empty, even though it was still full of people. Every corner of the Medina estate was filled with an invisible tension, as if the echo of the revelation between Marcos and Laura had seeped into the very walls, transforming the atmosphere into a stifling, oppressive place. Marcos remained seated at the edge of the bed he had shared with Laura during his stay. The silence now was deafening, and the space between them, once so intimate, felt like an abyss that could never be crossed. He knew Laura needed time, but he couldn't help but wonder if time would be enough to heal what he had broken. There was no avoiding it. He had shattered the trust she had placed in him. The sound of the bedroom door opening pulled him from his thoughts. It was Gustavo, his face serious, but with an expression that reflected more concern than anger. However, Gustavo's look conveyed that he already knew something. Perhaps he didn't know all the details, but the dense air in the house had given it away. Marcos, Gustavo began, his voice low and calm, but with a tense energy underneath. Can we talk? Marcos nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say. He knew he couldn't hide what had happened any longer. The weight of guilt continued to crush him, and he had begun to accept that he couldn't keep running from the consequences. Gustavo approached and sat down across from him, placing his hands on his knees. For a moment, he just watched him in silence, measuring his words, as if trying to understand what was going on before saying anything definitive. I've noticed things aren't right between you and Laura, Gustavo began, his tone direct but not confrontational. And even though I don't know exactly what's happened, I can feel that something has changed since you got here. Marcos looked at him, unable to hold the gaze for long. He lowered his eyes to the floor, struggling with the feeling that any word he said could shatter what little was left standing. You're right, he finally responded, his voice barely a whisper. I made a mistake. One that I don't know if it can be fixed. Gustavo's silence was deafening. He could feel the weight of those words in the air, as if the ground beneath his feet was slowly starting to crumble. What kind of mistake? Gustavo asked, his tone controlled, but with a growing unease. His normally kind eyes had hardened, waiting for what was to come next. Marcos gathered his courage. He knew it was time to tell the truth, that he couldn't keep lying. Remorse had grown in his chest like poison, slowly consuming him. And the truth was the only way to free himself, even if it hurt. "I kissed Victoria," Marcos blurted out, feeling the words stab him as deeply as they surely would Gustavo. Gustavo's face froze. For a few long seconds, time seemed to stand still. Marcos couldn't read what was going through Gustavo's mind, but what he did know was that the man before him was processing a betrayal he had never anticipated. "With my wife?" Gustavo finally asked, his voice restrained, his jaw clenched, as though every word was a painful effort. Marcos nodded, unable to lift his gaze. "Yes, it was one time. It shouldn't have happened, but it did. I regret it, Gustavo, I swear. I never meant to hurt Laura or you." Gustavo abruptly stood up, his face now transformed by a mix of rage and pain. He paced the room like a caged lion, trying to contain the explosion of emotions threatening to spill over. "How could you?" he finally shouted, fists clenched. "You were my daughter's boyfriend. And you dared to kiss her mother? You've destroyed everything. You've betrayed Laura, me, this family." Marco stood up slowly, knowing that anything he said at that moment would only make the situation worse. "There are no excuses for what I did," he said, his voice trembling. "But I swear, Gustavo, there was nothing else. It was a momentary mistake, and I felt devastated ever since." Gustavo looked at him, his eyes filled with a fury he could barely contain. "Don't talk to me about regret, Marcos," he shouted. "That doesn't change what you've done. It doesn't change the harm you've caused Laura, or the way you betrayed my trust." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that comes after a devastating storm. Marcos couldn't move a muscle. He knew he had crossed an irreversible line, and nothing he could say would change the fact that he had destroyed the most important relationship of his life. Gustavo took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but his pain was evident. After a few moments, his tone shifted from fury to something more grave and painful. "You need to leave, Marcos," he said, his voice rough. "You can't stay here. You've done enough damage." Marcos felt a lump in his throat. He knew this was coming, but hearing it felt like a blow to the stomach. "I understand," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry for everything." Without another word, Marcos gathered his few belongings, the weight of shame and regret tightening his chest. He walked toward the door, knowing this would be the last moment he shared with the Medina family. The heavy air of the house wrapped around him like an inescapable sentence. Leaving the estate meant more than just physically departing. It was leaving behind a life that, in a matter of days, had been destroyed. As he stepped into the garden, the gray sky reflected his gloomy mood. Every step he took carried him further from a possibility of redemption that no longer existed. As he walked toward his car, the echo of his footsteps on the gravel was the only thing breaking the overwhelming silence around him. The journey that had brought him to the estate had begun with hope, but now it left him with emptiness. A dark abyss that would follow him long after leaving that place. The rain had begun to fall again, transforming the air into a mix of coolness and dampness. Marcos had left the estate hours ago, and the silence in the Medina house was so dense it felt tangible. Inside, the tension still lingered, like a storm ready to break. Laura, still in shock from the revelation of the betrayal, had locked herself in her room since Marcos confessed what had happened. Victoria walked through the halls with soft, almost ethereal steps, as though trying not to be seen. She knew her daughter didn't want to see her, and guilt tormented her. Everything she had tried to protect had crumbled. The decisions she made to keep her life intact had only served to destroy what she loved most. And now, she found herself walking through her own house like a shadow. Gustavo, for his part, was in his study, holding a glass of wine, but the drink didn't soothe him. He had expelled Marcos, but the emptiness he left hadn't disappeared. The revelation of the betrayal by his wife and son-in-law had been devastating, but he didn't know what hurt more, Victoria's betrayal or the pain in his daughter's eyes. As the rain continued to hit the windows, Laura finally emerged from her room, her face marked by tears, but with a newfound determination. She had cried enough. Now, she needed answers. She wanted to understand how something so devastating could happen in her own home, how she had been deceived by the two people she trusted most. She descended the stairs decisively, but without making a sound, searching for her mother. She knew the conversation would be difficult, but she couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable. She found Victoria in the living room, looking out one of the windows at the rain-soaked garden. "We need to talk," Laura said, her voice controlled but firm. Victoria didn't turn around immediately. She stayed silent for a few seconds, as though preparing herself for what she knew was coming. Then, slowly, she turned around and looked at her. Victoria's face, usually so serene and controlled in other circumstances, now reflected the exhaustion of a woman who had lived too long among shadows and secrets. "I know," Victoria replied, her voice low. "There's no excuse for what happened, Laura. I can't justify it." Laura walked toward the center of the room, letting the weight of the situation fill her with an energy she had never felt before. She felt like she had spent her entire life being controlled by her mother's expectations, but now it was different. Now, she was the one demanding answers. "I want to know why," she said, her voice firm, but trembling at the end. "I want to know how you ended up kissing Marcos, my boyfriend. How did we get here?" Victoria sighed, closing her eyes for a moment before answering. She knew there was no way to soften what she was about to say, but Laura deserved the truth. "It was a mistake," she began, her hands clasped as if that might help her stand. But it wasn't just an impulsive moment. It was the result of years of wrong decisions, frustration, a life that felt empty, Laura. The words hung in the air, and Laura felt something inside her break. She had expected excuses, but what she heard was a kind of truth that hurt even more. Her mother, so distant and strong, was confessing that her life had been a series of accumulated mistakes. "Empty?" Laura repeated, unable to contain her rage. "Empty, Mom? You chose how to live. You controlled all of us, me, Dad. You always did what you wanted. You flirted with all my suitors, with all my ex-boyfriends. You batted your eyes at them, acted like a slut, like a prostitute. I don't know how Dad can stand so many affairs." Victoria shuddered at the harshness of her daughter's words, but she couldn't deny what Laura was saying. She knew she was guilty. "I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness, because what I did was unforgivable," said Victoria, swallowing hard. "But I want you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. And what happened with Marcos was a mistake that has no justification." Laura looked at her mother with disbelief, as if the person standing in front of her was a stranger. For years, she had sought her approval, tried to meet her expectations, and now everything seemed like a lie. "I don't recognize you anymore," said Laura, her voice breaking. "I always saw you as someone strong, unbreakable, someone who never showed weakness. And now I realize you've been pretending this whole time. You pretended to be someone you're not, and you dragged me along with you." Victoria lowered her gaze. She knew that in that moment, she had lost her daughter, if she hadn't lost her already. "Maybe I've always been pretending," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But I wanted you to have something better. Something I never had. I thought if I controlled everything, if I protected everything, you would never want for anything. But I failed. And in that failure, I dragged you with me." The silence that followed was deep. Laura stared at her, but there were no more tears. She was exhausted, empty. She didn't know what else to say, because all she felt was an immense void. "I can't forgive you now," she finally said, her voice cold. "And I don't know if I'll ever be able to." Victoria nodded, knowing that those words were deserved. There was nothing more she could say. Laura turned and started walking toward the door, but just as she was about to leave, she stopped and looked back at her mother one last time. "You didn't lose me today," she said, her voice trembling. "You lost me years ago, when you decided that controlling everything was more important than loving me for who I am." With those words, she left the room, leaving Victoria alone in the darkness of the house. The echo of the rain was the only thing that broke the silence, and for the first time in years, Victoria felt completely lost. As Laura climbed the stairs to her room, she felt a mix of relief and sadness. She had confronted her mother, but the answers she had received didn't bring her peace. They only left her more confused, more hurt. Once she entered her room, she collapsed on the bed, staring at the ceiling. She knew this was just the beginning of the end. Marcos was gone, her mother had crumbled, and her father, though strong, also carried the scars of everything that had happened. She didn't know how to move forward. She didn't know how to rebuild her life after everything had been broken. But one thing was clear, she would never be the same. The morning after the stormy confrontation with her mother, the sun filtered through the windows of the house, creating a stark contrast with the darkness in Laura's heart. The house, despite the daylight, seemed gloomier than ever, every corner filled with memories and secrets that now felt like chains. After a sleepless night, Laura decided that she needed definitive answers. With a firm yet trembling step, she made her way to Gustavo's study, where she knew she would find her father lost in his thoughts. Gustavo was sitting by the window, staring at the gardens, still marked by the scars of the rain from the previous day. "Dad, we need to talk," Laura said, her voice filled with a mix of desperation and resolve. Gustavo turned to her, his eyes reflecting the depth of the pain he felt, but also the unconditional love he had for his daughter. "Come, Laura. I know there's a lot you need to know," he replied, gesturing for her to sit next to him. The conversation that followed was one of the hardest in both their lives. Gustavo took Laura's hands in his, took a deep breath, and began to reveal the secret he had kept for so many years. "Laura, what I'm about to tell you, I should have done a long time ago. Your mother and I, we always wanted to protect you from the complications of our family. But now I see that was a mistake." Laura stared at him, her eyes full of contained tears, knowing her life was about to change forever. "Your uncle, your mother's brother, is your real father. It's something that happened long before I ever met Victoria. When we married, she was already pregnant, and I decided to love you as my own daughter, no conditions." Gustavo's words hit Laura like a hammer, destroying what little was left of her perception of her family and her own identity. "Why? Why keep me in the dark all these years?" she managed to say, her voice broken by the pain. Gustavo, with tears running down his own cheeks, tried to explain. "We wanted to give you a stable home, a place where you could grow up safe and loved. Your mother, she thought it was the best way to protect you from prejudice and gossip. But I realize now that we should have given you the option to learn the truth for yourself." Laura interrupted, frustration and confusion bubbling to the surface. "I don't understand all the secrets my mom talks about. She's always hiding things. How can I trust someone like that?" Gustavo nodded, understanding the depth of his daughter's pain. "I understand your pain, Laura, and I deeply regret not intervening sooner. I hope that, in time, you can find the path to process all this and find the peace you deserve." The truth had been revealed, but instead of feeling relief, Laura felt even more lost. She stood up, looking at Gustavo with a mix of love and disappointment. "I love you, Dad. I'll always love you, and I thank you for all the love you've given me as if I were your own daughter. But I need to leave here. I need time to understand who I really am, away from all the lies and shadows." Gustavo nodded, understanding her need for space and time to heal. "I will support you in everything, Laura. You will always be my daughter, no matter what. And I will be here when you decide to come back." With an emotional, tearful hug, Laura said goodbye to Gustavo. She didn't seek out Victoria, unable to face the woman who had given her life, but had also hidden the most fundamental truth from her. Laura quickly packed her things, each item and piece of clothing resonating with memories of a life she no longer felt was hers. She left the farm without looking back, her heart heavy, but with a firm resolve to rebuild herself, free from the shadows of the past. As the silhouette of the farm faded into the distance, the sky opened up before her, vast and unknown. It was the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one in which she would be the author of her own destiny. And although the path would be uncertain and perhaps lonely, Laura knew that each step would lead her to discovering her true essence, away from the expectations and secrets that once defined her existence. Years passed, and the Medina farm stood tall, majestic, and solitary. The fields bloomed every season, just as they always had, but life inside the house had changed. The family had scattered after the events that shook its foundations. Marcos had disappeared from their lives after that fateful evening, leaving only the echo of a mistake that could never be undone. However, time, with its mysterious ability to soften the sharpest edges of pain, began to heal the wounds. Laura spent the first few years trying to rebuild her life away from the farm, working in the city, finding her own way and slowly realizing that emotional scars take time to heal, but they are not impossible to mend. One day, 5 long years after that stormy confrontation, Laura received a letter. It was from her mother, Victoria, who, despite the distance, had never stopped trying to reach out to her. Laura had ignored many of those letters, still bitter about what had happened, but this time something inside her decided she needed to open it. Dear Laura, it has been 5 years since I last saw you, and not a day goes by that I don't think about what happened between us. It pains me deeply that we've drifted apart this way, and every day I regret what I did, the decisions I made, and the harm I caused you. I know there are no words that can fix everything, but I want you to know that I have changed. I have allowed myself to face my own pain, my own mistakes. And in this process, I realized that the only way to heal is through forgiveness, but not yours, mine, to myself. If you ever decide you're ready to talk, I'll be here. With love, your mother. Laura read the letter several times, feeling a weight that slowly began to lift. Over the years, she had worked hard to move on, but there was always something holding her back, a part of her that couldn't move forward without closing this chapter with her mother. She realized that while she wasn't ready to forget, perhaps she was ready to forgive. 2 months later, Laura decided to return to the farm. The road to her childhood home, which she had so often traveled with pain and resentment, now felt different. The air was fresh, and the landscape she had avoided for so many years enveloped her in a blanket of nostalgia. When she arrived at the house's door, the same one where she had left her mother alone that day, she felt her heart beat strongly, but with an unexpected calm. Victoria was in the garden, as she often did in the afternoon, tending to the flowers. She hadn't changed much. Her hair had grayed, and the lines on her face were more pronounced, but she still had that calm and steady presence that had always characterized her. When she saw Laura approach, she dropped the gardening scissors she was holding, unable to process what she was seeing. "Laura," whispered Victoria, as if she feared it was just an illusion. Laura stared at her for a long moment, feeling the years of separation, resentment, and anger beginning to crumble. There was no need for grand words, no need for an elaborate apology, because what they both needed was in that shared silence, in the presence of one another after so much time. "I'm here, Mom," Laura finally said, her voice calm. "I haven't forgotten, but I think I'm ready to try forgiving." Victoria took a deep breath, and a silent tear fell down her cheek. She knew that what Laura offered her in that moment was the greatest gift she could have ever hoped for, the possibility of reconciliation. "I can't ask you for more than that," Victoria replied, her heart in her throat. "All I want is to have you close again." Laura nodded, and the two women stood there, under the afternoon sun, not quite knowing how to begin again, but knowing they had taken the first step toward healing. Over time, Laura began to visit the farm more frequently. At first, the visits were brief, but little by little they became longer. Conversations were cautious, but every word was a small brick that helped rebuild their broken relationship. Laura noticed that her mother, despite being so controlling in the past, had changed. Victoria had become more introspective, more humble, and, above all, more open to her own mistakes. One autumn afternoon, while both sat on the porch, Laura finally spoke about what she had kept inside for so many years. "Mom," she said, breaking the silence as they watched the leaves fall, "I think I was angry with you for so long because I always tried to be what you wanted me to be, but I never felt good enough. I always thought everything I did wasn't what you expected." Victoria looked at her, her expression serious but calm. She had expected this moment, but hadn't wanted to force it. Now that it had finally arrived, she didn't know how to respond immediately. "It was never because you weren't enough, Laura," she said slowly. "It was because, in my desire to protect you, I couldn't see who you truly were. And that's what I regret the most. I loved you, but I loved you wrong. And that's something I will always carry with me." The wind gently stirred the branches of the trees, and Laura felt something inside her release. Her mother's words were everything she had needed to hear for years. "I understand now," Laura responded with a slight smile. "And that's what allows me to forgive you. Not because I've forgotten what happened, but because I know that what you did, although wrong, you did because you didn't know how to do better." Victoria smiled through her tears, and for the first time in many years, both of them felt that something had truly healed. The distance between mother and daughter, which had seemed insurmountable, was now slowly shrinking. The years passed, and although they never became the perfect family they once tried to appear to be, they both found peace in the truth, in accepting that human relationships are complicated, and that sometimes love isn't enough to avoid pain, but it is enough to heal it. Laura learned that forgiveness isn't always a gift for others, but for oneself, and Victoria, for her part, discovered that control was an illusion and that true love is built on vulnerability and letting go. Together, they continued to move forward, with scars that told stories of pain but also of healing. And in that process, they discovered that time doesn't erase mistakes, but it offers the possibility of finding beauty in what remains after them. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to leave a comment letting me know what you felt after hearing it, and if you've gone through a similar betrayal, I'd love for you to share your valuable opinion. I'd be very honored if you leave a like, share the video with a friend or family member, and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss the next surprising story that's appearing on your screen right now. We guarantee entertainment exclusively for you. See you in the next video.